Hello, I'm Juliet Mann, and this is the Agenda podcast, CGTN Europe's one-stop shop for smart, in-depth discussion of the issues that really matter in the world today. When President Trump announced 25% tariffs on all cars imported into the US from April, and the same levy on car parts from May, he described them as permanent. Since then, his hard lines on trade have become increasingly blurred. But as things stand, what are the implications of the somewhat erratic US trade policy for the automotive sector, global supply chains and the world economy? Joining me now are Dan Hearsch, leader of the Americas automotive practice at consultant AlixPartners, Burkhard Riering, publisher and editor at Germany's only auto B2B paper, Automobilwoche, and Zhang Yu, managing director of Automotive Foresight. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the agenda. Dan, let me start with you, because we're talking in the wake of some pretty bleak news on global growth from the International Monetary Fund's World Economic Outlook. And if things don't change, it's looking pretty bad for the auto sector in particular. What do you think Trump's tariff thinking means?
What we rely on in automotive, because it's such a high capex, long lead time, long development cycle industry, is knowing what the next few years is going to look like. And the way that these tariffs have been communicated and rolled out and constantly changed even up to the last minute has left automakers all over the world, all the automakers and their suppliers, just completely uncertain about what to do, what plans to make, and what actions to take. And so it's just highly disruptive. It creates a tremendous amount of wasted energy, wasted money, trying to plan for these things that are frankly unplannable at this point, because nobody trusts what they're hearing from the administration, from the news, from different governments, and their reactions to each other. So it's just absolutely chaotic within the industry right now.
So waste of time, waste of money. Burkhard, what do you think? What impact do you think that Trump's tariffs are going to have on the automotive supply chain?
Donald Trump basically announced global radical changes a month ago, but then suddenly he allowed exceptions in terms of tariffs for special components. He changed his mind within days. So let's call it the Apple effect, because of the largest American company would have suffered the most, maybe. And the car industry, a car consists of thousands of components that are produced all over the world. So the supply chain is global. There is no other way to work together. I think if you ask US, China, Europe, that China has advantages in terms of the supply chain, because China has the rare earth, has the influence on the consumer world of the Americans, and the US, in terms of the supply chain, is not the winner in that game. And if Donald Trump tries to relocate parts production to the US, I think it's not possible for suppliers, for instance, overnight. The time horizon for such a relocation is long, and companies do not have maybe these investments in their budgets. But by the time they have to set up a plant in the US, there may be other laws. So it's a crazy situation in terms of the supply chain. And we have to see what will happen.
Zhang Yu, what do you think? Would you agree with that? I mean, how do you see this playing out?
The automotive industry actually is a very much globalized industry. The supply chain actually very much intertwined among all countries, all major countries. Say, China actually exported almost 13 billion US dollar worth value components to United States. And also for all of those US car makers, they want to produce their vehicles in the US, actually their components may come from some nearby neighbor countries, actually cross the border, not just by one time, maybe 2, 3, or even 6 times to finish the tier 1 assembly component. And because of this tariff that will really hike those components prices, finally that cost will be passed to the United States consumers, actually.
Dan, let's look at some of the individual car makers and their response to Trump's tariffs. Stellantis, they said they're going to temporarily shut down an assembly plant in Canada. They've temporarily laid off nearly 1,000 workers in the United States. Do you see other US car makers following suit?
Yeah, possibly. Obviously, I don't know what's going on inside all of those boardrooms, but there are some pretty important vehicles that are only made in Mexico or only made in Canada or even other countries that the amount of time it would take to move production is years. Even if there was a plant ready, it couldn't be done in less than probably 12 to 18 months with a really, really intense and expensive effort. But the fact is, again, because the rollouts, the communication have been so inconsistent and hard to count on, automakers wouldn't go down that path of trying to move production where they don't already make a vehicle in the United States. And so the choices are either they have to absorb that cost, which destroys their margin. They have to pass it on to consumers, which is going to just decimate demand and sales, or they have to stop making them until they can get certainty and figure out what their longer term plans are. And how do you choose between those three at this point? I think in the one case that you pointed out, there was some certainty about that vehicle and what they could or needed to do. But there are others where automakers still haven't made their decision and don't know how to make that decision. Certainly not before the next probably 60 to 90 days when the next set of announcements happen. And that would be assuming that a lot of clarity shows up with that the next set of announcements.
Burkhard, in Europe, Jaguar Land Rover says it will pause all shipments to the US. BMW has quietly raised the price of its 2 Series. Volkswagen's floated the idea of making more cars in the US. I mean, what do you make of the reaction from European car makers so far?
There are various strategies, and it remains to be seen which is the best. Firstly, simply pass on the import duty of plus 25% to customers, but pushing through these higher prices is currently dangerous. There's a threat of slumping sales. Secondly, keep prices stable and accept the cost by the company that can safeguard sales, but however, it squeezes the margins, and margins are more important these days than sales maybe. Thirdly, the burden should be placed to the US dealers, which with new contracts at worse conditions. But however, this is likely to cause trouble and lead to dispute with partners, and who will not accept a shrinking margin. Fourthly, the relocation of capacities to the US, what is the target of Donald Trump, but expanding a plant or building new plant is also expensive, and the lead time for such projects are and the lifetime of the current US government maybe does not match. And last but not least, simply sit it out. Trump has often thrown his plans overboard. The industry suffers and inflation rises. He could withdraw the tariffs in the end, but the only question right now is who pays the bill.
And maybe it will be the consumer. I want to talk about a new report which was actually put out by Dan's company, AlixPartners, and that suggests that the Chinese auto sector might be placed to ride out this tariff storm, which picks up on something that you said earlier, Burkhard. Zhang Yu, this one's for you, though. With Chinese automakers looking to Russia, looking to the Middle East to offset the impact of US tariffs, how do you see it all playing out?
Relatively true, because China basically is still a country produce a majority of their production volume for domestic market, For example, last year we say roughly China produced 30 million total vehicles, less than 20% actually exported to the global markets. So still more than 80% of these vehicles stay within China, so which means that will not really be impacted by this tariff hike. For those less than 6 million exported vehicles, the majority of this volume were exported to the emerging markets, the BRICS, and also some of the European countries. China export a very small number of vehicles to the United States, which was about less than 100,000 units last year. So even all of these numbers will go down to zero. It does not really influence China's total export volume that much. So China can still expand their market in those large emerging markets, or even meet the smaller markets in those emerging countries. Maybe also targeting some European countries in the future. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. I'd imagine that there are some challenges for companies, for motor vehicle manufacturers attempting to redirect their exports to other regions. Burkhard, what would you say those challenges are for European companies?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I think that the US and China are by far the most important markets, and China is the most important. America is important too for the American car makers. They are a local market for American car makers, so they have a lot of market share. But the Germans and the Europeans can work there very well. And what do we have instead of that? They are always talking about India. India is coming. India is the next China, and so on and so on. But I hear that since 10 years, and we are still waiting for higher market shares in India, or a profitable business in India. So they are still waiting. And I guess it's between China, Europe, and the US what is really crucial these times.
Dan, I know this is changing on a dime, but Donald Trump has dangled something to help the car companies. Is this another handbrake turn, suggesting that maybe President Trump realises that tariffs on car parts could undermine that ultimate goal of revitalising American manufacturing and the American auto industry? I mean, after all, there's one report that suggests the tariffs could add around $5,000 to the cost of making a car in the United States.
It's awfully difficult to understand the logic and what the thinking is behind really any of the recent moves. Not all of them, but certainly the Canada-Mexico announcements, and as you say, the handbrake turn away at the last second. The reasons for it, or is it that the administration is realizing something, learning something, or are they just reacting, or is this all intentional and a little bit choreographed? It's really difficult to tell, because I think in a few months, looking backward, it will be much clearer some of the reasons for these decisions. I could only guess, and I will almost certainly be wrong about the reasons for it. Now, is it helping? Again, right now, it just feels like a delay, and what it is doing is it's paralyzing us. It's paralyzing the industry. It's paralyzing decisions about what to do with factories that are in other countries, what to do with sourcing decisions, what to do with the next EV program. That's really all it's doing. So, yes, it may provide what is seen as temporary relief, but nobody trusts it at this point. And it keeps the automakers, it keeps the large suppliers from making clear decisions. And you contrast this with the first set of tariffs back in 2018, Section 232 and 301 tariffs. Yeah. Those were clear. They were announced with certainty. They're still around today. That's what we need. We can deal with, the industry can deal with, increased cost and things that force us to shift production locations if we have that. But right now, it doesn't really help that much, because the automakers just can't use the information. They can't plan their business in the next 3 to 5 years, which is what we really need.
On his recent tour of Southeast Asia, President Xi reiterated that no one wins in trade wars. Zhang Yu, you could say that when one door closes, another one opens, right? So could Trump's auto tariffs actually help China's automakers?
Well, that's very much true. You see, China and the European countries, the EU markets got a lot of dispute in the past 2 years. EU wanted to levy additional tariff on China's EVs. This has been in discussion for quite some time. But because of this tariff war, and EU and China started to reach some kind of agreement so far, and they want to drop this extra additional tariff issue on China's EV. They may have set a kind of a price limit, the lowest price limit for China's EV to sell in the EU market. So in this way, if this actually really resolved and China's EV can export it to European markets in a very good term, I think this actually is a pretty good target markets for China's EV. That's actually kind of additional result.
Burkhard, what would you say the opportunities are for European companies in China if doing business in the US just becomes too expensive? I mean, the row between Europe and China over electric vehicles seems to have been rather overshadowed by the US tariffs. I mean, indeed, at this week's Shanghai Auto Show, Volkswagen unveiled 3 new EV models aimed specifically at the Chinese market.
Yeah, there are 3 concept cars, but yes, you're right. Volkswagen and others are now launching a massive offensive in China. And what I've heard today from our correspondent is that the German car makers are getting a lot of attention at the show, and so there are some optimism after years of decline. BMW, Audi, and Mercedes all have new platforms for electromobility. They're building cars for the Chinese market because the Chinese clients are different. Yeah, they are young, they are tech addicted, and they want something new and not these cars from a generation of their fathers. Yeah, which is Audi and BMW, and they have to beware of that they are cool. Yeah, like Chinese car makers, Chinese brands are now digital and cool, and that's what we have to be beware of. And they buy their own brands since years, and they have more than 50% market share, coming from 10% a few years ago. That was very fast, and even during the Corona pandemic, you have seen. You don't have seen what was going on in China, because within 3 years, all the cars were different after this time. The brands were different after this time, and maybe we in Europe were a little bit sleepy. China had a massive offensive, which was then to be seen after the lockdown. But this has nothing to do with the tariffs. That's another point. It is about the competitors and what the clients want, and maybe the Chinese car makers understand their people very well. Yeah, of course, and that's what we have a lack, and we are behind, and we have to catch up. Yeah.
But Dan, let's bring it back to the United States. I wonder if there's any real chance that US-based car makers, car manufacturers, will be able to come out on top here. I mean, look, consider automotive supply chains are global. Increases in other tariffs are going to affect metals, are going to affect minerals and parts. That's all going to raise production costs.
If you're asking, is there a chance that U.S. automakers come out on top in China, or even improve their lot as far as selling cars in China? I mean, the momentum's going absolutely the other way, right? It wasn't that long ago that the U.S. and European brands were fairly dominant, 10 to 15 years. It's only within the past few years that the Chinese automakers have become the largest exporters, right? So the market has completely shifted. It's the only growing market right now, so it's very attractive, but it's unlikely that the U.S. automakers, the Western automakers, are really going to change their lot there. Are they going to come out on top because of this tariff situation? The China specifically, U.S. companies have been moving away from China in large part for a long time, for probably 10 years, as China became more expensive than it used to be, and in a way that the labor and productivity advantages couldn't overcome the long supply chain and the cost of transportation. There was a gradual move to nearshoring in the U.S. That's been accelerated since 2018. It was put on steroids in 2020 and 2021 during the COVID crisis and semiconductor crisis. And now, the exposure to China directly is much less than it was. I mean, it's still there, but the moves to other ASEAN countries, to India, but more to Mexico and places closer to the U.S. Are mitigating that. And that's why the Chinese tariffs they're certainly can't be ignored, but they're not as devastating as the other announcements about reciprocal tariffs, the Canada-Mexico situations. All of those are much, much more disruptive and potentially damaging to U.S. automakers.
I want to come back to talking about people, talking about jobs. Burkhard, this is something that you mentioned just before, because the European automotive sector supports 13.8 million jobs. And a report in your publication suggests at least 15,000 of those could be at risk from Trump's tariffs in Germany alone. Disruption to this key industry is going to knock the broader European economy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely right. And one thing is about tariffs, the 15,000 jobs in the German supplier industry. But the problem is that everything comes at once. Geopolitics, new rules for emissions, and the difficult transformation to electromobility, digital disruptive business models. It's crunch time, and so I guess. If you have one or two problems, you can fix it, but this is all at once. And I can't say what will be decisive for job losses, but everything together will lead to massive job losses. And the 15,000, that was, you're right, precisely by the American tariffs. If it's for a longer way, these tariffs, and not just for a short time or for 1 year or two, because we never know what comes next in this erratic politics.
Zhang Yu, what do you think? Do you think it's also crunch time? I mean, sales and production forecasts globally are being revised down because of these tariffs. I mean, what do you think it all means for the auto sector in general?
Well, the impact will be very obvious, because if we look at the IMF latest economy forecast for the global GDP growth today, they say the global GDP will be impacted by at least 0.5 percentage point because of the tariff war. So if that's true, global total 90 to 95 million total vehicle sales. Say if only impacted 1% or 2% down, that almost means 900,000 units to almost 2 million. So which means, this only 1 or 2% down will impact a lot of people on the value chain who will lose job globally in a lot of countries. So that actually is pretty sad. Also in short term, some of the production will be impacted instantly because of the shortage of some of the components. Some of the factories may be shut down of some of the assembly line for certain vehicles. And also in short term, some of the consumers may have fewer choices. For example, the China also imported some of the vehicle from US, not just the Detroit Big Three, but also the BBA's luxury SUVs. They're all produced in the United States and then export to China. And those vehicles will be clearly impacted. And then here in China, they cannot get those vehicles at a good price. They probably have to suspend their sales temporarily.
Dan, I wonder if you chime in with this too, that when it comes down to it, this is all going to fall on the consumer. Are cars just going to get more expensive? And if so, what impact is that going to have?
I would say almost certainly, but not necessarily one-to-one, right? They're not going to go up by 25% or 100%, right? There is a competitive dynamic here. And there's a question of affordability. And things that come into that are interest rates are also fairly high historically in the U.S. Buyers in the U.S. are typically payment buyers. It's not necessarily the end price of the vehicle, but what you can get a loan for. And availability and interest rates don't support the other lever, which is longer terms and lower interest rates to lower payment, right? So at the end of the day, yes, higher prices as much as automakers can pass them on, but that runs into an issue of real affordability, and again, that's going to limit new car sales. It's going to increase the cost of used cars. People are going to be holding on to things longer. They're going to have to maintain them and repair them. It limits automakers' ability to comply with some of these new regulations that Burkhard mentioned, right? Because as their new car fleet sales, if they're selling fewer and people are opting for the less expensive versions, those are not going to be the EVs. Those are not going to be the ones that have a lot of technology to limit emissions. And so this all works counter to those policies as well, right? So tremendous impact on overall production and sales, and it becomes a vicious cycle, right? Because fewer sales means less production, means less fixed cost absorption, which means higher cost to make the vehicle, which will drive down profitability, and at some point somebody's going to fail, right? So some of the automakers and some of the large tier 1 suppliers are not going to be able to ride this out in the way that things are going.
Dan Hearsch, Burkhard Riering and Zhang Yu, thank you all very much. Remember, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find more agenda content on CGTN Europe's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Telegram, and YouTube channels. Until next time, goodbye.
The most interesting questions.
Are there other living beings beyond Earth?
Will man or machine be in charge?
Great question.
Always have more than one answer.
Well, hold on, let me just draw up a list.
And always come from more than one person.
That's where the credibility lies.
The concept of having a machinery which is alive and evolving didn't wait for us.
The end of inequality of incomes and wealth around the world, can you imagine how difficult that is at the moment to achieve?
Every episode, Stephen Cole, Murray Beveridge, and some of the brightest minds out there shed light on the answers to some of the most intriguing questions.
There are two ways of looking at this.
Machines can't really discriminate between civilian and military targets.
The Answers Project.
Maybe we need to just look at this in a bit more detail.
Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
The Answers Project, a new podcast from CGTN Europe.